One of the big cinematic releases of the year happens today. The Odyssey appears on screens worldwide, the latest blockbuster from a British creative genius, Christopher Nolan, the director who brought us movies like Dunkirk and Interstellar, for what it's worth, two of my favourite films. The Odyssey has already enjoyed or endured some unscheduled pre-launch publicity. Earlier this year, Elon Musk said that by casting a black actress to play Helen of Troy, Christopher Nolan had desecrated the Odyssey. It was, he said, an act of anti-white racism. A cowardly decision by Nolan, who had squandered his artistic integrity in order to tick various diversity boxes in the hope of securing multiple Oscar nominations. Does it matter whether the face that launched 1,000 ships is black, white or brown? All that really matters, surely, is that any actress who plays antiquity's most beautiful woman is beautiful. And there is no doubt that Lupita Nyong'o, the daughter of Kenyan parents, is very beautiful indeed, just as Diane Kruger, a German actress who played Helen of Troy in 2004 was, and now pushing 50, still is. But Elon Musk wasn't alone in his criticism. One leading Greek film director called it a hostile act against his Hellenic heritage. We can only wonder what the same director would have made of the BBC's decision when it produced its own version of the Trojan Wars in 2018 to cast a black actor as Achilles, even though Homer specifically describes the fabled greatest warrior who ever lived as light-haired. We've sort of been here before. In 2023, Netflix broadcast a 4-part life of Queen Cleopatra, which sent the Egyptians into a strop by portraying her as black, rather than a woman with the relatively white skin of the Ptolemies, whose ethnic origins were not even in Africa but Macedonia. The Egyptian Antiquities Ministry published a lengthy official condemnation of the Netflix portrayal. It was, they said, an attempt to erase Egyptian history. A lawyer in Cairo even mounted a legal campaign to have Netflix banned in Egypt for blackwashing the country's history. For many, the Egyptian reaction will sound like an overreaction. It's not as if, after all, that Hollywood has cared all that much about exactitude in its casting over the decades. Cleopatra may not have been black, but she certainly wasn't as white as Elizabeth Taylor, who played the Egyptian queen alongside Richard Burton in the 1960s. Equally, filmgoers who go to see the Odyssey today might notice that Matt Damon, an American actor of Scottish and Scandinavian ancestry, gets to play Odysseus without looking especially Greek. But there's a key distinction I want to make. When it comes to so-called colour-blind casting, there is a world of difference between fact and fabrication. The story of Helen of Troy is made up. She didn't exist. There are doubts about whether the Odyssey and the Iliad were even written by Homer. As for the Trojan horse and Achilles, pure fiction. Troy itself may not have been any more real than the lost city of Atlantis. But Cleopatra was real, very real. She existed. Dragged into the Roman civil war of Julius Caesar, she had 3 children to Mark Antony. Shakespeare may have gilded the lily of her life to shift a few folios, but the fact is Cleopatra was a genuine historical figure, belonging to a line of pharaohs that started with a general who served under Alexander the Great. So, and I apologise if this is a bit confusing, the Greeks, when they complain about Helen of Troy being played by a black actress, haven't really got a leg to stand on. There was no Helen of Troy, white, black or otherwise. But the Egyptians are right to get huffy when their most famous queen, an authentic foundational figure in Egyptian history, is portrayed as African when she was, in fact, of European descent. This may seem like splitting hairs, but I assure you it's not. And I think it's far more important than people think, or at least it matters very much to people outside the Hollywood bubble. We might think the Egyptians are being needlessly uptight about Cleopatra being depicted as black, but it matters to the Egyptians. One reason for that is one we would find rightly deplorable, and it's this. In North Africa, as anyone who's followed the treatment of sub-Saharan mercenaries in Libya, or the behaviour of the Janjaweed militia in Darfur, there is often a lot of racist discrimination directed against black sub-Saharan Africans by Arab North Africans. Netflix look at a history book and think, wouldn't it be a wheeze to make Cleopatra black? Egyptians look at a map and say, no you don't. We're North African, not sub-Saharan African. The Egyptians are not saying this from a position of racial tolerance, but that doesn't make them wrong to insist on an historically accurate depiction of their own national heroes. When the Cleopatra row blew up, the British mixed-race actress who played the role and who'd previously appeared in the hospital drama Casualty said, "If you don't like the casting, don't watch the show," which sounds perfectly reasonable. Except it's not. It is entirely legitimate to object to something you don't even watch. I refuse to watch snuff videos, but I know I don't like their contents. And I don't like the idea of Hollywood or the BBC taking a life that was actually lived and pretending that the protagonist's race is irrelevant. Does that make me racist, giving a toss, for instance, that TV producers choose a black actress to play Anne Boleyn, an actual and important figure from British history? To those who say I shouldn't care, let me ask how you'd feel about important figures from history, black or Asian figures, being played by a white man. We've reached the stage now where the idea of casting a white actor to play Othello, who existed only in Shakespeare's imagination, would almost seem sacrilegious. Imagine then the outcry if Netflix chose Matt Damon to play Martin Luther King. There is a lot of muddled thinking going on here, and it's not bigoted to unpack what's going on. There is almost no story, no matter how central to our sense of what it is to be British, that is immune to colourblind casting. Last summer, the BBC released its dramatisation of the Battle of Hastings, about as significant an event in our island story as it's possible to imagine. The BBC producers didn't just make anonymous Anglo-Saxon foot soldiers black, which is a bit like putting white extras into a line of Zulus at the Battle of Rorke's Drift. They took actual key historical figures from the battle, noblemen who actually existed, whose decisions affected the course of our history, and had them played by black actors. It's hard to think of many countries, maybe any country, where this playing fast and loose with history would go largely unremarked upon. The Egyptians cry foul when Hollywood blackwashes, but we Brits barely blink. I think this reaction actually comes from a good place. We don't want to tell artists how to go about their art, although when the art is produced at our expense by the BBC or Arts Council, whether we want it or not, we may have rather more right to take umbrage. Perhaps we need to learn to be a bit more indignant, not because we're thin-skinned, but because if you think about these things rationally and methodically and without being terrified of being called a racist, the honesty with which we present our history is important. History can constantly be reinterpreted. I'm personally a huge fan of Winston Churchill's, but I accept that scholars can make the case against him and endlessly reconsider his role in our island story and world events. But it would be a shock to see him portrayed on screen by Idris Elba. You can reevaluate almost anything about Churchill's decision-making, his influences, his mistakes and victories, how much he drank, how much he slept. You can't reevaluate his race, any more than you can make Anne Boleyn black or the Norman nobility who fought alongside William the Conqueror black. If you start mucking around with an immutable, incontestable characteristic like race, we can't really trust you to be honest about anything. The producers who argue for colourblind casting, even when it's used to portray things that actually happened and people who actually lived, say that to even notice these ethnic discrepancies is to reveal a certain unease with diversity. Well, I disagree. If it reveals anything, it's the cognitive dissonance of those who think it's desirable to spend a lot of time and money to make sure that costumes and buildings and weaponry and backdrops are historically faithful to the period in which they're set, and then not care that a figure from history is depicted as having a racial heritage they could not possibly have had. Verisimilitude is the name of the game, apart from where skin colour is concerned. TV and film folk make every attempt to weed out anachronisms, apart from the most obvious. In the BBC's otherwise brilliant dramatisation of Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, the lighting was so realistic it was hard to see what was going on. Life in the 1500s was dark, and so was the series. No artificial lighting apart from the odd candle. But the same production team that seemed so obsessed with historical accuracy, even down to the amount of natural light shown on camera, then dotted the Tudor court with a sprinkling of diversity that was totally unrealistic. It produced some very strange juxtapositions. In one episode, a racially mixed group of characters are seen at Hampton Court Palace standing in front of a tapestry which is completely mono-ethnic. Presumably it would have cost the BBC's set designers too much money to commission a new tapestry to reflect their multicultural version of London under Henry VIII. Because for all that some race activists like to insist that Tudor Britain or Norman Britain or Roman Britain were basically not all that different from today's diverse Britain, the tapestries tell another story. The Battle of Hastings, as reimagined by the BBC last year, presents an utterly implausible vision of how our country looked getting on for 1,000 years ago. But in another millennium-old story of that battle, there is not a single person of colour. It's called the Bayeux Tapestry, one of the finest displays of needlework ever produced, but very far from offering a view of Norman Britain to match the BBC's ethnic patchwork. So there's an important dividing line to be drawn between fact and fiction, between colourblind casting for stories that actually happened, with people who actually lived and changed our nation, and rollicking made-up yarns that constitute popular entertainment. Perhaps we need an on-screen disclaimer, something to the effect of this dramatisation is based on historic events, some of the facts have been changed, including the race of historical figures. Black actors would still get the gigs, which their talents deserve, while the rest of us would get an acknowledgement that the history being served up by the BBC and others is not a faithful representation of the facts, but an exercise in social engineering. That said, I still reserve the right to harumph in front of the children when, for instance, I switch on Poldark and see a black barmaid pulling pints in a 17th century coaching inn somewhere in the depths of Dartmoor. It's annoying and silly rather than insulting. It breaks through the fourth wall and makes the viewer feel they are being lectured as well as entertained. The argument, let's call it the Bridgerton defence, is that because there was a handful of non-white Britons in Georgian or Regency England, we mustn't be surprised to see screen depictions of that era in which every other person is a person of colour. This, of course, is the logic that drives those who play the national lottery. The odds of it happening are infinitesimally small, but not categorically impossible. It could be you. Or in this case, it could be them. The Victorian hero of Charles Dickens's eponymous David Copperfield really might have been Asian. Or the abbot in C.J. Sansom's Shardlake could have been a black African, not remotely likely, but technically not impossible. It could be true. And this, I think, is the ultimate purpose of colourblind casting, to stop us noticing skin colour. And I think in some respects it's a laudable goal. Problem is, the race relations industry has spent decades sensitising us to race, insisting that we should notice racial difference, mustn't appropriate other people's cultures. So when producers start parachuting black actors into a story like the Battle of Hastings, which is very much part of our culture, we might begin to think that if there's any cultural appropriation going on, it's the native culture that's being misappropriated. The assumption, I think, is that we must accept that double standards are the price we have to pay for our former sins. Through their empires and slave trades, the white folk have imposed their version of reality on the global majority and can't expect to be treated fairly as a consequence. We trashed their history, now it's time for ours to be trashed. Or something equally demented like that. Again, there'll be some people listening to what I'm saying who will think there goes an embittered old white man tilting at windmills. And they might be right. But I don't think so. Because I genuinely believe that if we tolerate an absence of reason in something seemingly superficial, like the things we watch on the telly, it will open the way to bigger untruths, ones which are less trivial. As with small children, and as a father of 6, I speak with some authority on this, if you tolerate minor fibs, you only serve to encourage some major whoppers. Back to where I began, the release today of Christopher Nolan's Odyssey. As I've explained, I don't think a black Helen of Troy is a big deal, any more than Disney making Snow White Hispanic ought to give anyone a sleepless night. But if you are one of the thousands who pack out cinemas this weekend, you might want to consider not the films, but the adverts that run before the film even begins, because it's in the adverts where I think the law of unintended consequences for our creative industries really begins to bite. Last year, one study found that black actors appear in more than half of all commercials shown on British TV, while making up only 4% of the population. Where does it come from? This dogged determination to sell soap powder and cars and holidays, often if not usually with the aid of mixed-race couples. There is, I'm fairly sure, no conspiracy to airbrush, for instance, white men from our screens. There is no guiding mind trying to create an impression of Britain to the British, of a nation more ethnically diverse than it actually is. I say this, I think, with confidence because the same study also showed that other groups were neglected and marginalised. Pregnant women, for instance, only appear in 0.1% of adverts. People over the age of 70 appear in 2%, even though they make up 15% of the population. The disabled, also largely ignored. That wouldn't have happened if advertisers were working in concert. But just because something isn't contrived or planned doesn't mean it isn't happening. The advertising industry hasn't cooked up a scheme to make Britain look blacker, much blacker than it actually is. But taken together, the action of hundreds, if not thousands, of advertising agencies and businesses has had that effect. Why? Because of the corporate terror which made so many executives lose the plot about race in the wake of the killing of a black man called George Floyd 4,000 miles away in America 6 years ago. In aggregate, it looks deliberate, putting black actors who make up only 4% of the population into more than half of adverts. In reality, it's sort of accidental. But the effect is still potentially toxic. Our creative industries, film, TV, advertising, theatre, choose to ignore the emotions they stir among the native white population by disproportionately depicting Britain as far less white than it actually is. Why should that be a problem? Or maybe it won't be. But I do wonder how much it bothers young white men. Do they harbour a growing sense of cultural alienation if the country reflected back at them on screen appears to be actively downplaying their visibility? However, this is not just about who is shown on adverts, it's also about how they're shown. Earlier this year, the Advertising Standards Authority banned an advert about sexual harassment on public transport from Facebook because it, quote, had the effect of perpetuating a negative racial stereotype about black men. Adverts showing a white assailant and black victim were not banned. If only this stopped at the adverts. This is a bigger problem than that, bigger than colourblind casting, bigger than whether the film, TV or advertising industry mucks around with history or overstates the representation of some groups on screen at the expense of others. After all, there is only so much latitude a creative can take with Homer's script for the Odyssey. There's only so many ways of reinterpreting the life of Cleopatra or the Battle of Hastings or the court of Henry VIII. But when it comes to modern drama, where the screenwriters have a blank page, we are really off to the races. And even the lovey classes are waking up to this. Earlier this year, in an interview with the Radio Times, the actor Christopher Eccleston, former Doctor Who, noted that drama was addicted to the portrayal of white middle-aged men as villains. TV drama portrays a world that does not exist, but which its creators wish did. If you switch on a police drama, or worse still, any show that dramatises how the intelligence services tackle terrorism, then you will have noticed certain tropes. The good guys, the top spooks, the senior detectives are often not guys, but women of colour. So too the main character. The bad guys are invariably white, often posh, though as with the BBC's terror thriller The Capture or Apple TV's Slow Horses, scriptwriters reserve the right to draw bad guys from the white working class too. Even though Islamic extremism accounts for more than 3/4 of MI5's casework, the vast majority of terrorists on TV are white men. TV drama is a world turned upside down, where female cops possess superhuman fighting skills, allowing them to routinely rough up male adversaries. Older white men, if not the actual perpetrators, will fill the role of incompetent bosses, lording it over younger, more diverse subordinates who solve the crime while Whitey flounders. It's predictable, and because it's predictable, God knows, it's incredibly boring. There is no suspense in a thriller when we know that the man we are initially invited to suspect is black. He'll almost invariably turn out to be the wronged party. Some will say none of this matters, it's only fiction. But this ignores how much our mores and values and sense of the world are shaped by the stories we tell about ourselves. It ignores how much critical race theory, a concept imported from American university campuses, has now firmly embedded itself in Britain's creative sector, with its fundamental belief that whiteness, a desire to oppress others, is intrinsic to white people, whether they know it or not. And it also ignores how much our elites are willing to blur the lines between fact and fiction. The almost hysterical critical reception for the Netflix drama Adolescence last year is a case in point. It was a fine show, brilliantly acted and filmed. It was not, however, as Keir Starmer misinformed the House of Commons, a documentary. But it was an attempt to portray white working-class boys in a way which risked demonising them and ignoring certain inconvenient truths about so-called toxic masculinity. Surveys show, for instance, that when it comes to the power of influencers like Andrew Tate over the lives of young men, it is black and Asian boys who take his version of the manosphere more seriously than their white counterparts. I'll finish where I began with the global release this weekend of the Odyssey by Christopher Nolan. Elon Musk goes much too far when he calls the decision to cast a black actress as Helen of Troy an act of anti-white racism. But it is true that by making one of European civilization's great founding fables into an exercise in colourblind casting, Nolan is drawing attention to the whole question of how art reflects life through the prism of race right now. Because anyone who watches TV or film or adverts, be they white or black, will have noticed in recent years that artists, screenwriters, directors, playwrights, while they very much like to see themselves as radical and iconoclastic and transgressive and revolutionary, they're actually deeply, deeply reactionary, terrified of straying from the approved script on race. They serve up the same cliches about evil white men and virtuous black women. They think they're being edgy by challenging our preconceptions, by showing that, guess what, the terrorist was not the Muslim after all, or that the most venal man in the room is not the black guy in the hoodie but the posh white man in the suit. Nobody's fooled, not least non-white audiences who have every right to feel patronised by these new stereotypes. On a couple of occasions in my previous life as a TV presenter, I was a guest at the BAFTA Awards. Almost anyone who sat through the speeches and sixth-form moralising of actors and directors who appear at these ceremonies will, I think, share my conclusion that celebrity is not wisdom, that being recognised in the street is not a qualification for telling the rest of us what to think. They say the camera never lies, but when it comes to the most sensitive areas of life today, particularly portrayals of race, it increasingly comes pretty close to peddling propaganda. Bye for now. At Outpost, we are committed to free speech and shining a light on untold stories that matter. To support our documentaries, reports and podcasts, please like, share and subscribe to our work on Substack, YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Thank you.